Let me ask you then about the banking sector. Valentin, you touched on this a little bit earlier on about how the low interest rate environment is just making it incredibly difficult in banking. And it's not in the very creative side of banking that life gets difficult there. It's the more kind of vanilla side, isn't it? It's making lending make money. And there's nothing positive you can tell the banking sector on that front. Rates are just going to get lower.
Yeah, and obviously the curve is flatter or indeed inverted, which is bad news for the banking sector with the maturity transformation and all that. All I want to add was really the fact that at the moment where rates are so low, really also that's dampening volatility, and so that trading revenues are down as a result of that, and it's kind of adding up to a fairly dire kind of a picture for the banking business as a whole. And I mean, Deutsche Bank is just one example of that. I guess what the central banks could do and have done in the past to alleviate the pain from low rates really would be to introduce tiering or indeed ways to kind of shield at least some of that profitability for banks hoarding excess liquidity. And that's one of the considerations obviously on the table for the ECB. We may get some signs of that really potentially materializing as a scenario really for the ECB September meeting, but we may get indications already in July. And indeed, if Draghi mentions that, investors will see that as a sure telltale sign that rates will be heading lower again.
So tiering of rates is one thing that might change the dynamics for banks. The ECB has been pushing cheap loans out to the banking sector through these TLTROs. I've been having a lot of conversations with guests recently about transmission mechanisms for central bank policy and whether they are broken to the economy. Do you see a lack of demand for some of this cheap money in Europe? And is that actually more the problem?
The key issue is not only in the Eurozone, which is bank-based financial systems, but also in the US, there's a lack of business loan growth. So in general, companies, especially if you talk to multinational companies, they like to rely on their reinvested earnings rather than really rely on bank loans. And that is reaching a point where really the ECB tries to pump money into the economy. That money never reaches the real sector of the economy. Instead, banks are hoarding cash. They're penalized for that by the ECB, and that's eroding their profitability. So it's sort of a vicious circle. So I think keep saying creativity. That's not actually cutting rates and tiering. I'm not sure I would call it excessively creative. It's just a sign actually of lack of fresh ideas really there. And from that point of view, investors would be justified to kind of be a bit more bearish or remain less optimistic about the outlook for the banking sector.
Paul, your thoughts on the banking sector? I mean, people have talked about how cheap it is for a very long time, but cheap doesn't mean it doesn't get cheaper.
No, that's right. It feels like a value trap, really, and that's something which has been the case for a while. There's a couple of structural issues around economies as well in Europe, in particular, also in Japan, as we've already mentioned, which make it very, very difficult from the perspective of the rate scenario. And I'd central banks, I think, would ideally like to put rates up. It would help the banking sector, but also in an ageing population where an increasing amount of cash deposits are not earning any return for retirees and people who need that income, and forcing them into riskier investments, potentially in the stock market or in other areas. I think that's a very uncomfortable situation at a time when pension deficits are growing for governments and so on. So I think from that perspective, the idea of putting rates up would be certainly radical and too radical, I think, for most central banks, but something which structurally would help. I think banks being healthy, being profitable is an important part of oiling our economies, and that's something which you've alluded to. And I think the central banks are alive to that, but I think they're really caught in a bit of a trap.